Hello, welcome back. I have a reading update for you today, and I am just going to get right into it. So the first book I want to talk about today is Amy Tan's The Joy Luck Club. I went into this very optimistic. I was really looking forward to this. I had been looking for this book for quite some time, and this was the first copy that I had seen in something like a year. I've been looking for this for quite some time. And I recently saw an episode of Siskel and Ebert. I've been watching old episodes of Siskel and Ebert, and in one of them they reviewed the movie The Joy Luck Club, and it looked very interesting. So I was hoping that this would be a really good read, and I have to admit that it did not live up to my expectations. So I'm a little bit nervous to talk about this because I probably have a little bit more negative to say about this book than I do positive. And so what this book is about is that there are four older women who are part of a mahjong club and have been for 40 years. One of them passes away, and the younger woman, or her daughter rather, has to sort of keep this tradition going. So she joins the Joy Luck Club. That is part of it. That is a very small part of it, really, as far as this novel goes. It's more of an introduction to the women, the older women, and their daughters. So the plot of this book is that we have four older women, all of whom were born in China and grew to adulthood in China before they came to the U.S., and their four daughters and the relations between them. All their daughters were born in the U.S., and it is sort of about the tension between the traditions of China that these older women have brought with them and the Americanization of their daughters. And we are shown each of their stories in 8 separate split narratives. So we will go with one of the older women for a little bit, and then shift to one of the younger women, and then back to one of the older women. And we only get snippets of their stories at a time. And their stories are really interesting, actually. Their stories are really rather beautiful. I mean, there is, for instance, one of the women, she had grown up with her grandmother and her aunt and uncle, and her mother had disgraced herself because when her husband died, she had gone off to marry an older man, a rich old man, and she became his third concubine. And we gradually learn how that came about, and it's really through tragic circumstances how that happened. And it's about how this young girl navigates her life with her grandmother, her aunt and uncle, and then moving into this rich man's house where there are, I believe, there's his first wife and then his 4 other wives in this sort of westernized mansion in, I can't remember exactly where it was. That was a really, really interesting story. And another of the older ladies grew up very, very wealthy in a very wealthy family. And we follow her from when she's a little girl into when she marries a man that she's not really, I don't even know how to explain it. Like, she doesn't like him at all, but somehow her not liking him means that she became his wife. That wasn't really well spelled out. So we get a look at this woman's life in this very wealthy family, the consequences of her marriage, and how that didn't really work out, how she wound up coming to America. And we also get the younger women's stories about how their lives are going. They went to, the schools they went to, their time growing up, their husbands, their boyfriends, the men who are divorcing them. And really and truly, I didn't find their stories nearly as interesting as the stories of the older women because they were kind of mundane and predictable, I guess. And all of the men in this book are really cardboard. They're really shallow. I mean, this is not a book about the men, so that sort of makes sense. But the men in this book, they don't even really seem to have any personalities or anything like that. For instance, one of the younger women is in the process of divorcing her husband. He's a doctor, and I never felt any sort of I never felt any sort of interest in this divorce because the characters are really so thin that they don't have enough depth for us to really care about them. And I think that is something that really marred this book overall, in that there are some really beautiful images, some really interesting backstories. They've all gone through traumas. These older women in particular have gone through very serious traumas in their lives. But there are 8 separate characters, and it is very hard to keep up with which character is which, because the stories are all told from the first person perspective of I did this and I saw this, and the trouble with that is that their narrative styles, their narrative voices are all so very similar, and their characters are so thin that I repeatedly throughout reading this book, we would go from one story to the next, and in the middle of reading a story, I would forget whose story I was currently reading, and I would have to go back to the beginning of the chapter and um, remind myself of which character we were following currently. And I also couldn't keep track of the mother-daughter relationships, like who was mother of which daughter, and how. So it was really hard to link their stories together, because this happens very often with so many characters, and we're leaping from one narrative to another. I feel like this book would have been better served if we had followed one pair of mother and daughter throughout their whole story, and then switched to the next pair, and then the next pair, and then the next pair. I feel like that would have made a great deal more sense, and it would have allowed the reader to firmly cement in their minds who was who. Whereas going back and forth was really rather confusing, and I think it took away from the overall plot, just because you have to constantly be reminding yourself of which character you were currently following. And so I think that the main issue between these mothers and their daughters is that they don't communicate with each other at all, really. I mean, the mothers kind of tell their daughters what to do, and the mothers can be very, very critical of their daughters. Sometimes they need to be, but they don't really have any open lines of communication. They don't have a back and forth. There is not a do this, and then the daughter asks why, and then the mother really goes in depth about an explanation of why. These daughters are pretty much completely ignorant of their mother's backstories. Their mothers have never sat down and told them, this is what it was like when I was growing up. These are the people that I knew. These are your family members. This is what it was like for me. Part of that, I think, is perhaps because the mothers believe that their daughters won't believe them. Like, they won't believe their stories, because some of these women were very, very wealthy, and the things they go through are awful. And just living in that traditional Chinese society of, say, arranged marriages, or of particularly the disgrace of the one character's mother, the concubine, that is probably very hard for an American child to understand growing up in San Francisco and in the 80s and the 70s. I think the most memorable character of all was Waverly Place Joan, and she was named after the street the family lived on in San Francisco's Chinatown. And she's really only memorable because when she's very young, she becomes a chess prodigy, and she's in all these tournaments all across Southern California. She's very, very good. And she doesn't like the way that her mother is sort of using her as a living, walking trophy. And so she eventually just quits playing chess entirely. And really, if it wasn't for chess, I think that her story would be rather forgettable. Um, and like I said, that was my main trouble, was keeping up with which character was which, because they're really not all that well defined as individual characters. Rather, we are given really dazzling backstories, but I think without the depth of character, the book suffers overall, because we really need not only those dazzling backstories, those really interesting backstories, we also need some kind of individual personality on which to fully develop these stories, and I just didn't feel like it was there. I did enjoy it. I enjoyed reading it, but I don't think I would reread it because it seems to me that those dazzling images were really the bulk of the story, and that the actual characters themselves were just not well developed. Even say the friendship between these four women in the Joy Luck Club, we don't really get an idea of, we're never really shown why they are friends. Their friendships are really kind of thin. They met in the church, and they had really started going to this church so that they could improve their English, and they just meet every weekend to play mahjong. And I don't know, there just wasn't really anything there between them other than that they met in the church and they play mahjong. And I just really, really wish that Amy Tan had really fully fleshed this novel out, really fleshed these characters out. I think this could have been really, really good. But because of that, because I'm not saying that there is no characterization there. There is characterization there. It's just not to a level that any of these characters are particularly memorable in and of themselves if you were to take them out of their backstories. And I think that is my main issue with this book. And also, like I said, the the 8 separate split narratives was really confusing at times. And yeah, I guess that is my review of the Joy Luck Club, or really not my review, but just my thoughts about the Joy Luck Club. I think I think there was so much potential here, but that it just fell short of what it could have been or what it should have been. And I'm going to stop talking now. Okay, that is the Joy Luck Club. And the next book I read was a collection of essays by Slavenka Drakulic. It is the Balkan Express. And so Slavenka Drakulic was Croatian, and this book was published in the early 90s. I think this copy is from 1994. And so she grew up in communist Yugoslavia, and communist Yugoslavia broke apart and became quite a few separate nations. For instance, the ones that I remember: Slovenia, Croatia, Serbia, Bosnia-Herzegovina, and I think Kosovo. I'm not sure exactly if that is correct. So this book is a collection of essays and I think a letter in which she is writing for magazines and newspapers, not only in Croatia, but also in Europe and the United States, trying to explain what it is like in the beginning of so the whole 90s were really fraught with wars in the Balkans. Very, very savage wars, very, very messed up wars. A lot of very awful things happened in the Balkans in the 90s. And so she is talking about acts of genocide, of what it is like to live in Croatia, in Zagreb. I believe it was Zagreb. Forgive me if I got that mixed up. Knowing that the front line is only 60 miles away, knowing that just down the road people are being killed, people are being massacred. And this is really about her coming to terms with the fact that her nation is at war. She talks about how there are people in Croatia, intellectuals and an actress in particular, how they failed to understand these splits between these nations. And so that would get them into some hot water, and they were receiving death threats and things like that because they couldn't understand, they couldn't make the transition really from being Yugoslavians to being Croatians, because they had grown up thinking that everyone was part of one nation. And now we have all these separate nations and they're killing each other. And so some of the things they said really infuriated particularly the younger people. She talks about at one point she went to Slovenia to stay in her friend's apartment. Her friend was off in France, working in France, so she left Croatia during this war, during the beginning of this war, and she gradually comes to understand that she is now a refugee and what it feels like to be a refugee. she's not a genuine refugee because she is going to go back to Croatia. But she talks to an old man in Slovenia, and when he finds out that she is Croatian, he basically says, "Yeah, you're a bunch of good for nothings who are, our government is paying you all this money," and they weren't paying them any money or anything like that. Uh, and she really had trouble with that because just a few years before, they had all been part of one country. She talks to some of the younger soldiers who were fighting in the war. She talks to them about their backstories, where they came from. One of the young men tells her about how he had witnessed it. They had all been fighting in their hometown, and this was really a war where overnight neighbors became mortal enemies. And he talks about how he saw a man beaten to death who was actually one of his friends, and he was beaten to death by two brothers, their friends, because he had killed their parents. They all knew each other, but because he was a Serb and they were Croats, he had went over and killed their parents. And so they beat him to death. And just things like that. I really enjoyed these. Now, I didn't enjoy the content. I enjoyed Slavenka Drakulic's writing very much. I've read a book by her called, I think, Cafe Europa. I'm not entirely sure. And that was really good, also about growing up in communist Yugoslavia. And it's a really interesting look at, the breakup of Yugoslavia, the descent into these wars, the descent into realizing that she's living in a country at war, that not only is her life on the line, but everyone around her's life is on the line, including her daughter, her friends. She talks about the breakup of these friendships that have lasted a lifetime, that she can no longer go into Serbia, even though just a short time before she could go there without any problems, and how really all this just seemed to happen overnight, that people found it very difficult to believe that there was anything going to happen. So when it did happen, they were just shocked. And I really can't go into the depths of the wars in the Balkans. Reading about them is very confusing for someone from the United States, because there are a lot of different countries and a lot of different groups, and a lot of things happened over these years. And it's very hard to keep up really with who was who and what happened when. And say Croatian and Serbian words are rather hard to pronounce if you don't have any training in them. So it's a little bit hard to keep up with. But this was I think this would be a really good introductory volume for getting an idea of what it was like to be there at the time. Now, clearly she didn't see anything herself. She wasn't involved in any of the combat or anything like that. She was living not really far away, but far enough away where really they just had to worry about air raids and that sort of thing. She does go to the front line at one point, and she talks about how she knew this place had been shelled very shortly before this, that people had been killed in this town and just left to rot in the streets. And she talks about how she realizes that she's standing in the middle of a graveyard, and just her teeth just started chattering, and she was just terrified all of a sudden, and the soldier she was with just had to lead her away. And she got to go back home, but they had to stay there. And there are just people living in this town, and indeed it was shelled very hard the night that she left. I really like the way that she writes. So I'm always looking for her collections. I really enjoy reading them, and I really thought this was well done. There are a lot of typos in this book for some reason in this edition. I don't know if they are in the other ones, but I just noticed that there are a lot of typos in this one. Okay, so that is the end of my video. I hope I have done these books justice. I always come away from these videos feeling like I haven't done these books justice. So we have The Joy Luck Club by Amy Tan and The Balkan Express by Slavenka Drakulic. And that is really all that I have been reading. Those are the only two books that I have finished in the past week. I'm still reading the Sherlock Holmes stories. I'm still reading a short work of nonfiction every day. And I don't know what I'm going to read next. I have absolutely no idea. Right now, I am completely in between stories, in between books, and I don't really have any plans, which always makes me a little bit nervous, but I am still reading. I do still have my in-between book going. I haven't read it in quite some time. It is, I cannot remember exactly what it is about. I remember, or what it is called, rather. I can't remember the title of it. It is about the goddess image throughout history, the archetype of the goddess throughout history. And it's been quite some time since I picked that up. So perhaps I will just read that today. I don't know. I'm also reading a few horror short stories here and there. And so I want to thank you for joining me today. And I hope very much that you will join me for the next video. And I'll see you next time.